Welcome to Disturbingly Cheap Reviews. This week I'm giving you a double dose of cheap as I take a look at two video game tie-ins, Dead Space Downfall and Dead Space Aftermath. These animated movies were both released as prequels to the video game series of the same name. Now Downfall was a prequel to the original Dead Space, which followed an engineer named Isaac Clarke, who wore a mask and stumbled upon some rather nasty looking monsters with a penchant for detaching limbs. Aftermath is a prequel to the recently released Dead Space 2, which follows around an engineer named Isaac Clarke who no longer wore a mask and stumbled upon some rather nasty looking monsters with a penchant for detaching limbs. Of course that is an oversimplification to the highest degree, but who cares, because it's time to get to the movies. Downfall, in theory, was to give information on the Dead Space universe and help to clarify how the creatures, known as necromorphs, overran the game's first location, a ship known as the Ishimura, while showing the attempts of the crew to survive that attack. And it's rather bland. In it, we do indeed show how the monsters moved from the planet Aegis 7 onto the Ishimura, but it's rather anticlimactic and kinda silly. After that, the prequel becomes a hack-and-slash horror movie that follows the pattern of heroes go to new place, heroes get attacked, a lesser character dies, heroes run, heroes go to new place, heroes get attacked, a lesser... you've got it by now. Our main character is the security head and overall tough female Alyssa Vincent. We follow her team whose sole job is to protect all of those on board. And as you may guess, with this being a prequel to a survival horror video game, this does not go very well at all. On the subplot point of things, the ship's doctor, Kyne, I believe is how you pronounce it, begins to worry about the ancient marker that was loaded onto the ship. But his worries are constantly shot down by the ship's captain, who is hiding... something. So in all, the first prequel gets a D. The story falls apart quickly as the animators shove forward to show off how much blood and violence they can throw on the screen. Dialogue is just downright laughable at times. Anyone wanting answers from the original game are probably going to be disappointed as the prequel glosses over or just gives half-hearted answers. As for spoilers, they will come after our next review, which I am skillfully segueing into right now. Dead Space Aftermath takes a different approach than its predecessor. While Downfall was a completely animated prequel, this one slips into CGI. This helps separate present time from the stories being shared, which can be slightly distracting as characters constantly change both looks and build. We start the film by meeting our four survivors of the O'Bannon spaceship. They include a female doctor, a one-arm engineer, a hallucinating guard, and a mad scientist. They're rescued and taken aboard a ship where they are interrogated on what they had saw. So in essence, this movie is a flashback, as we're introduced to new and somewhat interesting characters and calmly wait to see how they will die. And personally, I feel this one comes off better than Downfall. It's hard to make a prequel to any horror-related, whether game or movie, and build suspense when it's rather obvious that anyone who isn't around for the original story has less chance of surviving than a parrot at an alligator convention. Okay, that analogy may make no sense, but I think you get my point. I will reiterate that changing the animation depending on whose story was being shared was a bit distracting to me. I know why they did it, but it was distracting. The way they progress the story is okay, so in all, I'll give this one a C. Improvements from the first, decent story structure, builds to the game, the animation's distracting, and some of the points are dull. Now to get to the fun part of the review. Spoiling the endings! Starting with Downfall. The necromorphs end up on the ship due to the complete ignorance of one man. A miner goes down to Aegis 7 during the start of the insanity and finds his girlfriend, who promptly kills herself in front of him. Assuming the ship's doctors can fix a nearly decapitated head, he throws her on his small craft and takes off. Of course, something infects her before takeoff, and his daring trip back to the Ishimura ends with him being ate before a monster rushes to infect the rest of the crew. From there, it isn't too hard to figure out. Our heroes repeat the cycle of a hack-and-slash horror until we are left with our main girl, Vincent. She manages to stumble to the mysterious marker, finding out that the monsters won't attack her while she's near it. After a brief nap, she has a hallucination, and then makes a run for a recording device to send a distress signal. As the necromorphs realize she is no longer by the marker, she rushes and triggers a lever to open the pod bay door, sending the creatures flying out into space. The only problem is, she can't hang on and is flung out herself, cueing a rendition of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which was heard in advertisements for the first game, which really was just referencing it for the sake of referencing it. We close out by showing the ship that is carrying Isaac Clarke nearing the Ishimura. Aftermath survivors get the following treatment. Each tells their own part of how they survived the necromorph overtaking of their ship, usually after an interrogator inflicts a personal fear on them, which seemed kinda excessive. I highly doubt they had a reason to hide things. Well, except for the mad scientist, but he's a mad scientist. Anyway, the hallucinating guard breaks out of the interrogation and runs rampant through the ship, sees his daughter outside and opens a door, getting sucked out into space, along with a few space marines. I was kinda hoping they'd float by Vincent along the way, but they don't. The one-armed engineer, who was the most likable character in my eyes, he gives his story, he's promised to return home, and he's promptly shot in the back of the head. The mad scientist? Well, he came in contact with a shard of the marker, which promptly drove him insane, so he is stored away for later study. But don't worry, he's a jerk who was cheating on his wife with the doctor, and later killed his family due to hallucinations. And if you play the game, you can probably expect a Dr. Nolan Strauss to show up. I wouldn't expect him to be too helpful. And finally, Dr. Cho. She is the one who finishes the story and explains how they destroyed the shard and monsters before a man named the Overseer appears with an offer for her. As they leave to talk, the interrogators join the body count, just missing out on being part of the game. Dr. Cho ends up rejecting the Overseer's offer to help test the mysterious marker and is lobotomized and framed as a terrorist, accused of sabotaging the Ishimura, the O'Bannon, and Planet Aegis 7. Maybe she should have taken a minute or two to think over the offer. So there you go. That's the prequels to the Dead Space games. I've enjoyed this little experiment, and I hope it wasn't too muddled. So until next time, whether you wear a mask or not, watch out for those limb-detaching monsters.